Hey everyone, today we'll be discussing the lymphatic system, which is often closely tied into the immune system. So these two work together to provide immunity. Now, if you think about life on Earth, we're surrounded by millions and millions and trillions, billions, large numbers of bacteria, fungi, microorganisms all over the place. So much so that they're even deep down in the ground. You have to travel maybe a kilometer down in the ground, and there's still bacteria there. So there's microorganisms everywhere around you. But inside of our body is, for the most part, a sterile environment. And the lymphatic and immune systems are what provide that sterile environment. Any colonization of our body by microorganisms is called an infection, outside of the microbiota that we have that are beneficial organisms. So we do have bacteria, in our gut, for example, that are beneficial to us, that we have a symbiotic relationship with. But outside of those that our bodies are allowing to remain, most of our bodies are sterile. They're clear of microorganisms, and that's because of the activity of the lymphatic and immune systems that we are able to maintain that sterile environment. So the immune system, of course, consists of no organs per se, but the immune system consists of cells, white blood cells, that are going to provide immune function. Now, the lymphatic system is going to be working in concert with those immune cells to provide immunity, particularly by draining fluid from the tissues. So let's think about our capillaries that are serving oxygenated blood and releasing fluid at the level of the tissue that's going to bathe cells in nutrients and oxygen and remove carbon dioxide. So remember, inside the blood in these capillaries, you have proteins like albumin, and there's going to be, this arterial side of the capillary is under high pressure. So you have that pressure causing fluid to kind of circulate around and provide nutrients and, again, oxygen to the tissues that those capillaries are serving. And those proteins, those albumin proteins, because of their osmotic pressure that they create, are going to bring some of that fluid back into the blood, but not all of it. So lots of extracellular fluid here is going to build up, and there has to be a way to relieve that fluid, to remove that fluid so that you don't get swelling, which is called edema. So excess swelling or edema is bad for a number of reasons that we can get into later. But not all of the fluid returns to the venous circulation, and so there has to be another mechanism to get rid of this extracellular fluid that surrounds the cells of the tissue. So what is actually going to be the structure that accomplishes that goal of removing that extra fluid is another set of capillaries. So surrounding the tissue is going to be what are called lymphatic capillaries. And these kind of weave around. If you look in your book, it shows more of a weaving structure, that these are overlapping each other actually at the level of the tissue. So you basically have this meshwork of circulatory system capillaries and your lymphatic capillaries. But so what the lymphatic capillaries are doing is the pressure that builds up from this fluid around the tissues is going to cause movement of that extracellular fluid into a lymphatic capillary. And these lymphatic capillaries are considered blind-ended, so they do have kind of a dead end at the initial spot where the fluid is going to travel into them. So as pressure builds up out here, as you get more and more fluid being delivered to the tissue, that puts pressure and causes movement of fluid into the lymphatic capillaries. And once that fluid is inside the lymphatic system, the fluid is called lymph. So the lymphatic system, I mentioned, is tied in commonly with the immune system. So how does this contribute to immunity? Well, in addition to fluid making its way around the cells of a tissue, you can also have pathogens. So let's say you have an injury, you have a cut or a scrape or a burn, something like that, that opens up your first line of defense, which is your skin. And let's say we get some microorganisms, some bacteria that make their way into the fluid surrounding a tissue. Now, if left unchecked, these bacteria, or whatever the microorganism can be, can have a fungal infection, bacterial, or parasitic. These bacteria are going to divide, and they're going to colonize this tissue and eventually cause cell death and disrupt this tissue. So there has to be a way to clear bacteria from around a tissue. And the way that that happens is those bacteria are going to also move into these lymphatic vessels, the lymphatic capillaries. And the lymphatic capillaries are going to merge with one another. So they start out small, just like when you think of arterioles and venules, they start out small and they merge together with other vessels to form larger and larger lymphatic vessels. And these are eventually going to get to deliver that lymph fluid along with whatever bacteria or other debris might be in this fluid around the tissue. Is going to get transported through the lymphatic system. And eventually, in the lymphatic system, it includes little organoids called lymph nodes, where you have lymphocytes. And lymphocytes are a type of white blood cell that are going to help clear infections. So the lymphatic system is delivering excess fluid, and eventually that will get back into the circulation. But in addition, it's basically collecting all of the pathogens that might be present in a tissue and delivering them to a place where they can be eradicated, at a place like a lymph node, where you have your immune cells that are waiting to take care of the challenge, the bacteria. In addition to bacteria, other substances can build up around the tissue. So I mentioned albumin being that protein that causes osmotic pressure in the capillary. Well, sometimes albumin can leak out of the capillaries. Capillaries are designed to prevent this, but sometimes it does happen. And the more of those proteins you have out in the extracellular fluid around the tissue, just like they did in the capillary, that's going to increase osmotic pressure here. So if you have osmotic pressure pulling more and more fluid around the tissue, that's another cause of edema. So swelling, again, is bad. We want to prevent that. And just like bacteria and fluids can move in, proteins can also enter lymphatic capillaries and be taken away from the tissue so that it doesn't contribute to extra swelling, which could be harmful. So these lymphatic capillaries collect lymph containing proteins, pathogens, and water for the most part, and deliver it to a place where it can be purified through the action of white blood cells, and then finally that fluid can be returned to circulation. So let's now think about the structure of these lymphatic capillaries for a second. So these are functionally similar to blood vessels, but there are a few differences. So if you look at this layer of cells that makes up the walls of these lymphatic vessels, near the level of the tissue in the lymphatic capillary, if you looked closer at these little finger-like projections of these lymphatic capillaries, they're actually made up of cells that kind of overlap one another, like this. And there are little gaps between those cells. So when pressure builds up out here, when you have fluid build up, say out here, that puts pressure on the walls of these lymphatic capillaries and causes these endothelia. You have endothelial cells that make up these capillaries, causes them to kind of kick open and allow some fluid and potentially pathogens and proteins to enter into that capillary. So again, these endothelial cells kind of open up like a door, and then the pressure that builds up from fluid moving into the lymphatic capillaries is going to kind of close the door. So they open up, let things in, pressure builds up in here and closes the door. So this loose structure of the lymphatic capillaries kind of, it's another example of structure assisting function. Their function is to collect things, and so them having this loose structure is useful. So we'll go on and look in more detail at the larger segments of the lymphatic system here in just a minute. So here I have kind of a crude diagram of what the lymphatic system might look like from a bird's eye view. So up here you have the cells of the tissue where that extracellular fluid is being drained away in those lymphatic capillaries. And you can see that those capillaries are going to merge with other small vessels to form eventually larger and larger vessels like lymphatic trunks. Now, again, it's kind of similar to the circulatory system where smaller vessels join up, merge into larger as they travel toward their ultimate destination. For the lymphatic system, that's again back to be delivered back into the blood. But along the way, as that fluid travels through the lymphatic system, you have the presence of those lymphoid organs that I mentioned previously, called lymph nodes. And inside the lymph nodes, you're going to find lots of immune cells, your white blood cells. So the lymph nodes, when that fluid passes through them, act as a filter. So inside that filter you have lots of immune cells that are basically acting to trap and take care of or get rid of any bacteria or other pathogens that may have made it into the lymph vessels. So your lymph nodes are going to act as a filter that's going to help to keep your body sterile and remove pathogens. So when you're talking about that lymphoid tissue that acts as a filter to remove pathogens, we're really talking about a couple of specific places, like the lymph nodes, which I previously mentioned act as a filter for the lymphatic system. And outside of those lymphatic vessels, you also have what's called mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, or MALT. So because it's mucosa-associated, where you find mucosa are the places like in your digestive tract where there's mucus that's trapping pathogens. So you have lymphoid tissue that's associated with that mucosa, like your tonsils, your Peyer's patches in the small intestine and the appendix. And these are just collections of lymphoid tissue that's going to also serve to filter out pathogens. And it's important to have those in your digestive tract because there's lots of pathogens being introduced that way. When you eat food, you're going to take in some amount of bacteria that's going to need to be dispatched so that it doesn't cause infection. And your tonsils, lots of people have probably had an infection of their tonsils, and it's a place that's really prone to infection because it's at the head of your alimentary canal, your mouth. There's lots of exposure to pathogens there. So the tonsils are a little place where those pathogens kind of are collected, and within that lymphoid tissue you have immune cells that are going to help dispose of that. But just because of the amount of exposure that they get, the tonsils are kind of prone to infection. So within those lymphoid tissues, I mentioned that we have white blood cells, or going to be cells of your immune system that help us to fight off infection. So first we have the lymphocytes, and they're named that because they're going to be primarily found in the lymphatic system. So those lymphocytes consist of T cells, which are going to be kind of helper cells that help out the function of B cells. B cells produce antibodies, and antibodies are how we recognize pathogens, how our body kind of specifies what it is that needs to be destroyed. And T cells kind of help out with that process in many cases. And T cells can also be toxic to pathogens. Aside from those lymphocytes, we also have phagocytes. So remember, phagocytes are cells that do a lot of eating. They swallow pathogens. And of those, the number one type of phagocyte is the macrophages. Macro meaning they're large phages. So these are mature monocytes, which is a type of white blood cell. And macrophages are going to be responsible for kind of swallowing and destroying lots of pathogens. And you also have a cell type called dendritic cells. You may think of the dendrites of the neuron. They're called dendritic cells, and dendrites are called that because that term means kind of spiny processes. So dendritic cells have these little projections on them that reminded someone who studied them of dendrites, of spines. So they call them dendritic cells. But they're also going to be lumped in with the phagocytes that you find in a lymphoid tissue. And another important part of lymphoid tissue, if you looked inside of a lymph node, for example, or some other lymphoid tissue, you would see lots of fibers, reticular fibers, kind of making a meshwork in that tissue. So these would be those reticular fibers. And those fibers are going to be a place where the immune cells can kind of crawl around, and it becomes forms sort of a spider web where pathogens get trapped, and the cells that are crawling around on those reticular fibers can dispose of those pathogens. So you also have reticular cells inside the lymphoid tissues that make those reticular fibers, those thin fibers that are going to be kind of the spider web inside of a lymphoid tissue. So as we saw when we were talking about the circulatory system, there are mechanisms in place in the lymphatic system to ensure one-way flow of fluid through those lymphatic vessels. And particularly if you think about the venous portion of the circulatory system, we remember that the venous system has valves that prevent backflow. And the lymphatic system has valves just like those. So pressure builds up, fluid pushes through a valve, and that valve closes as the fluid moves in this direction. So that prevents backflow and forces flow of lymph to only proceed in one direction, toward a lymph node, or eventually back toward the blood. And in addition to those valves preventing backflow, you also have smooth muscle surrounding lymphatic vessels. And that smooth muscle is going to contract, kind of like a peristalsis, forced urine out toward the urinary bladder. Smooth muscle contraction is also going to force fluid to flow in one direction in the lymphatic system toward the lymph nodes. So here's a relatively simplistic diagram of a lymph node. And again, the function of the lymph node is to basically serve as a net that's going to trap bacteria or pathogens, whatever those may be, and filter them out of the lymph. So you have an afferent lymphatic vessel and an efferent lymphatic vessel. And you should remember these terms. It's kind of the same directionality as we saw in the glomerular capillaries. So the afferent lymphatic vessel is delivering lymph to the lymph node. And once that lymph enters the lymph node, you'll see there are kind of two regions of the lymph node. Here in the outer region, you have the lymph node's cortex. And in the cortex, you'll find B and T cells. So lymph flows in there, and that's where you're going to get kind of this primary activation of the immune response with B and T cells. And as lymph flows toward the center of the lymph node, it's going to travel toward the medulla. So just like we saw in the kidney, there's an outer cortex and an inner medulla. And in the medulla, you'll find phagocytes, macrophages, as well as some mature B cells. So there's some subtle differences with respect to where you'll find certain cells inside of the lymph node. But you're going to find all the key players, those lymphocytes and immune cells that are going to be taking care of any pathogens that make it into this filter. And once the lymph has been filtered, once you remove those pathogens, the lymph that's now hopefully mostly free of pathogens is going to escape out the efferent arteriole and head toward the next branch of the lymphatic system before it can be returned to the blood. So this is a really efficient way of filtering out pathogens, and you've got the cells there that can take care of them. So in this introduction to the lymphatic system, the last thing I want to talk about are two of the major organs that comprise the lymphatic system, the largest of which is the spleen. And so to this point, we've talked about filtering out the lymph. But in addition to filtering out that lymphatic fluid, the spleen is going to be responsible for filtering the blood. So this is a major function, very important. And if you had an infection that spread in the blood, it could then theoretically spread to every tissue in your body. So removing pathogens from the blood is a very, very important function to prevent things like sepsis. So your spleen is going to filter blood, and it's going to contain kind of two functional regions. Of course, it's got a blood supply to bring blood to the spleen to be filtered. But in addition to filtering out pathogens, the red pulp of the spleen, and it's called red pulp it's because it's got this red look to it. The red pulp its purpose is to destroy erythrocytes, red blood cells. So during the course of the life of a red blood cell, it gets beaten up, getting pushed through all these capillaries, and red blood cells have a shelf life, and so they need to be removed from circulation when they've gotten old and are no longer as efficient at things like carrying oxygen. So destruction of old erythrocytes is an important function of the spleen, and you have phagocytes, those macrophages, large phagocytes that are going to digest those old erythrocytes. Now the other part of filtering blood is removing, again, those pathogens, and there you're going to have the white pulp. And in the white pulp, you're going to have your white blood cells, those leukocytes. So all sorts of different leukocytes are going to be there, and they're going to be contributing to this function of filtering out pathogens from the blood. So the last lymphoid organ that we'll talk about is the thymus, and unlike the other ones that we've talked about, its job is not to act as a filter. There's no pathogen removal that's a part of the function of the thymus. What its function is to assist in the maturation of T cells, which again are important immune cells. So the thymus produces hormones that are going to encourage T cells to mature so that they can be functional in protecting the body from infection. So the T cells are called T cells, or a lot of people refer to T cells looking at the fact that T stands for thymus. So if you think about where a T cell matures, it's the thymus. B cells is in the bone marrow. So in the thymus, there's those hormones that are produced that are going to allow T cells to mature. And it's much more active in children than adults. So through the course of your life, the thymus is actually going to atrophy. It's going to get smaller and smaller and be replaced by adipose tissue and eventually become mostly non-functional because you've built up a stock of T cells that are useful for fighting off infection. But as a newborn, in young people, the thymus can be very large compared to what it is in a mature adult. So the activity of the thymus kind of slows down as you progress into adulthood. But maturation of T cells is its important function. And it's kind of got this bilobed structure. It's got two lobes. And again, as you mature, the structure of the thymus is kind of turned into mostly adipose tissue. So that'll do it for our introduction on the lymphatic system, and we'll kind of move on and progress and talk more about the cells of the immune system and how the immune response is coordinated and how it works.